always had kind of that thought that I was different. I study with music on because there's always 1,000 thoughts in my brain, but when I have music, there's only two, what I study and the music. And no one could relate to that.
You, my friend, are well-credentialed, but you didn't find out you had ADHD until you were in your PhD program. And I'm curious what that was like for you.
Ludovico sent amour di Chanaz
is a multilingual neuroscientist with a PhD specializing in memory research and a published author in current biology.
Diagnosed with ADHD mid-PhD, he immersed himself in the study of neurodivergence
and became a certified coach,
blending science with personal experience to support others.
Now, he's on a mission to empower neurodivergent individuals
to transform their challenges into strengths.
People say ADHD is a new phenomenon, that humans, only experienced it due to our current environment. So just in the last few generations, we're seeing this explosion of ADHD, and it's all because of our current environment. Can you tell us why that's false?
First of all, yeah, ADHD has always been around. So,
Welcome back to the Dr. Brighton Show. I'm your host, Dr. Jolene Brighton. I'm board certified in naturopathic endocrinology, a nutrition scientist, a certified sex counselor, and a certified menopause specialist. As always, I'm bringing you the latest, most up-to-date information to help you take charge of your health and take back your hormones. If you enjoy this kind of information, I invite you to visit my website, drbrighton.com, where I have a ton of free resources for you, including a newsletter that brings you some of the best information, including updates on this podcast. Now, as always, this information is brought to you cost-free, and because of that, I have to say thank you to my sponsors for making this possible. It's my aim to make sure that you can have all the tools and resources in your hands and that we end the gatekeeping. And in order to do that, I do have to get support for this podcast. Thank you so much for being here. I know your time is so valuable and so important, and it's not lost on me that you're sharing it with me right now. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, or share this with a friend because it helps this podcast get out to everyone who needs it. All right, let's dive in. Ludovico, welcome to the Dr. Brighton Show.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here.
I am so excited for this conversation. I came across you on Threads, so online, and you, maybe you don't even remember this, but you had reposted something that was similar to mine. Like you had posted something similar to mine, and people were like, "Hey, you lifted Dr. Brighton's stuff," and you were like, "Oh, I should have tagged her. I was inspired by her," and I just was like, "That just shows such high quality character, and I want to know this person." And then I started digging into your content, and I was like, "I am so fascinated. We have to have a conversation."
Thank you. I remember actually the thread, and I was like, I don't want to make anyone feel bad about this. And I was just inspired because it was great content, and I just wanted to kind of remodel it a bit. So yeah.
Well, and I also feel like I always give a lot of leadway because I feel like with the neurodivergent brain, sometimes I pick up information everywhere and then it gets compiled, and 6 weeks later it's my own and I think it's an original thought, and then people are like, "You were obviously inspired by this person." And I'm like, "Oh, I forgot about them. I forgot they existed."
Yeah, and also when we do content, especially about science, at the end of the day, whenever there is converging information, because we're all going to be looking at science and papers, at the end of the day, we're going to be making converging content as well, because that just, I don't know, it makes sense somehow.
Totally. And that's something I think people don't understand, is that when there is scientific consensus, we're all going to sound pretty similar. We're going to be saying the same things.
Oh yeah, it's going to sound boring, but at the same time, this is what papers say, so we're not going to say something else. Then there's the personal experience, which is going to be different in every person. And then there's kind of the mix of both, which is what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about the personal experience because you, my friend, are well-credentialed, but you didn't find out you had ADHD until you were in your PhD program. And I'm curious what that was like for you.
It was not completely unexpected. I've always had kind of that thought that I was different, from how other people functioned. A very simple example of this is me in high school saying to everybody else, I study with music on because there's always 1,000 thoughts in my brain, but when I have music, there's only two, what I study and the music. And no one could relate to that, right? And I learned about ADHD actually only when I was into my second years of master's, so really late into the process. And I started the process of diagnosis only when I was during my PhD, basically. So it was really late, but it wasn't that big of a surprise on one hand. On the other, it just made a lot of sense with a lot of things in my life. Yeah.
Do you feel like it would have been helpful to know earlier, like in terms of accommodations or helping you be more successful?
It probably would have helped, at least in terms of self-awareness, because I kind of always wondered why I was feeling exhausted where everyone else was feeling fine. So that would have helped at least to know where it comes from. It probably would have changed a lot in terms of what I ended up doing. Because I always was a hard worker that strived to do a lot of things. And that hasn't changed much even since my diagnosis. It just probably would have made life easier in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I always wonder, when people get diagnosed late, like how would it have looked differently at all, or would it have been the same? So I feel like even once you get diagnosed, you're like, well, now what? Like, what actually do I do? And it takes many years to really figure out, okay, knowing this information, what actually changes for me?
Yeah, there's a process of grief that is going on because you have to come to terms with what being neurodivergent means. Because up until that point, I think I always had that kind of thought that maybe I'm just like everyone else. I just am not trying in the right way, right? I just didn't find the answer. And actually, when you get diagnosed, you're like, there is no answer. It's just your brain's different. So now you have to adapt to that. And I think what it gave the diagnosis, there was definitely this process of grief. But at the end of it, there was a lot of acceptance and a lot of self-love and a lot of guilt that went away from me not being able to do certain things that now instead I just delegate or I just don't focus on that much. Whereas before I was desperately trying to conform to what everyone else was doing, of course, without any success. And now instead I just focus on what I know I can do and I delegate what I know I can't.
That guilt piece that you just said, that is something I hear from so many people is the thing they're able to shed when they finally get the diagnosis. And I do think getting a formal diagnosis has utility. I also know within the United States, there are a lot of barriers to that, whether it be cost, whether it be time. There's these factors that go into healthcare that make it difficult, that definitely creates barriers. And so I think people learning about it online, learning through things like this podcast is really hopeful. And often people will say, well, what's the big deal? Everyone's a little bit ADHD. As we know, that's not true. It's like anybody with ADHD, we always roll our eyes. I'm like, if you only knew the struggles, friend. But with that, that's the biggest thing I hear people are able to let go of is the guilt of feeling like I'm not enough, I'm not doing enough. Why is everybody else so successful and I'm not? How come it's so easy for everybody else and it's not for me? And I feel like there's a lot of judgment, shame, stigma that we really internalize, but also we cultivate sometimes. Yep. And that you're able to drop all of that once you have that diagnosis. I mean, not immediately. As you said, there's the grief phase. There's like I feel like for myself, I was like, oh, wait a minute, this all makes sense now. And then it was like, oh gosh, like the poor little girl who was treated so unkindly, unfairly, and also was so cruel to herself sometimes. You're able to really process that.
Yeah, and then there's all the anger that goes out to the world, as in, why didn't anyone tell me before? It would have been so easy. And I mean, we go through all of the stages, honestly. It's draining on one hand, but on the other, it's also very relieving at the end of the journey. I feel that it's a really great place to be at the end, where you kind of just accepted that this is how you work, so you can now take some steps to get better, to heal. And that also takes a while.
It does. And we're going to talk about some of that today. But before we get into that, you're fluent in French, Italian,
Yep.
and English. Are you also
Yes.
working on Spanish now?
I am fluent in Spanish and also Greek, actually.
Okay, so there's 5 languages.
Yeah.
I know that 3 of those was by 18. I'm curious, how did you do that? Because I think some people who are neurodivergent, they really struggle with language altogether. I'm just curious, like, how were you able to achieve that? I think it's a huge achievement to be fluent in 5 languages, including Greek. I'm like, that's amazing.
A lot of it, to be honest, is luck, right? Because I was born out of a French mom and an Italian dad. So I started right off the bat with 2 languages. And then when I was 12, we moved to Athens in Greece. And I just learned Greek because that's where I lived. And then English in school because they teach you English. And we had some amazing professors as well. And in Greece, for example, also all the movies are in original language. You don't really have a lot of translations except for kids. So you kind of just tend to also learn English right off the bat.
Yeah.
And then Spanish. After living in Spain for 6 years, I kind of just learned it quite well. It's
Well,
just
I think it's-
living in places.
It is definitely something. I thought I would move to Puerto Rico and I would like be able to work on my Spanish and pick it up. It's very different. And even in Mexico, which is where my family's originally from, they're like, oh, okay, so Puerto Rican, completely different. Spain, Spanish, like it's different. But I do think it is quite an accomplishment to be able to speak so many languages. And that's why I was really curious. Like, how did you accomplish that? Immersion. Immersion. It's basically, when people say like, when you just like jump head first into the water, you're going to swim or you're going to die. Not so dramatic. But with the language, it's like you just got thrown into it.
Yeah, basically, yes. And I mean, now living in Barcelona, most of the people who live in this city are already bilingual as a minimum, because you have Catalan and Spanish, which are usually taught together. So if you learn English or you have a third language because your parents are from somewhere else, then you grow up with 3 languages minimum.
Yeah. No, Catalan, when I was in Spain, that threw me. I was like getting by my Spanish, and then I was at a restaurant and I was like, what are the words coming out of your mouth? Like, I don't understand.
It sounds so different. It's kind of a weird mix between Italian, French, and Spanish, and it's really difficult to understand when you're not used to it.
Yeah. Do you feel like ADHD was a hindrance in any way for you to be able to pick up new languages?
For languages, not necessarily, because it's always been a part of kind of my experience and my identity, right? Growing up already with 2 languages and learning more along the way, even as a kid, it's not something that I experienced was necessarily super difficult. I've always loved learning languages as well. And probably, also studies show that this might have given me some sort of advantage or compensated for my ADHD in some sort of way as well.
Oh, no, you have to say more on that.
Well, I mean,
you have to say more.
Especially in Barcelona, actually, because there's so much bilingualism. There's a lot of studies on people who are bilingual, and it actually shows that growing up with 2 languages increases brain plasticity and cognitive functions such as executive functioning. So it actually could have helped, right? But no, learning languages was not, I guess, harder or easier for me than it would have been for anyone else. But also I grew into it. So I'm also very conscious of the privilege that I had regarding this.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say growing up with 2 languages, the neuroplasticity. My oldest son has ADHD, and he picks up languages very easily. So he speaks English and Spanish, and now he's working on French. He pushes me. He's like, I want to learn Japanese. I want to learn this. I'm like, one thing at a time. We're going to like go stepwise, because it's that ADHD tendency, You get really excited. You want to do all the things, then you burn out and you do none of the things. And like, let's just pace ourselves. But something that I found really interesting in the research as well is that the language your mother speaks is what is highly influential. And if your mother's bilingual, you're more likely to be bilingual. As a mom, I kind of feel like a failure because I'm not as fluent as I would like to be. But I think that's something that's really interesting as well. You having parents who spoke multiple languages and how that may have influenced you.
Yeah, that might be the case as well. I mean, both of my parents spoke, multiple languages. So I've always been around these kind of environment that kind of pushed me and nurtured me into being curious, I guess, about learning more things. But also, I mean, to be honest, kids pick up languages super easily. So there's also that. When you learn languages when you're young, there's all the phonemes and all the tonalities and all the things that get into your brains so much more easily than when you're an adult. If I were to learn a new language right now, it would be massively more complicated.
Yeah. Well, I'm in my 40s. I'm still going to make it happen.
Yeah.
So I want to shift gears because I want to talk more about ADHD.
Yep.
People say ADHD is a new phenomenon, that humans, only experience it due to our current environment. So just in the last few generations, we're seeing this explosion of ADHD, and it's all because of our current environment. Can you tell us why that's false?
So it's not 100% false. I'm going to start with that, actually, which is maybe a weird stance to take. But first of all,
no, I kind of
ADHD has always been around. It has always been around, right? There is especially one genetic study about a professor called Dr. Oscar Lau that actually works here in Barcelona. And he has done a genetic study on people who lived more than 30,000 years ago, right? So on remains, anthropological, archaeological remains, and they actually analyzed the whole history of humanity, including Neanderthals until today, by trying to find biomarkers and genetic markers of ADHD. And what they actually did find is that the genetic underpinnings of ADHD were present already 30 to 40,000 years ago. So first of all, definitely something that was present way before TikTok, right? Yeah. Then, then we also have some descriptions of ADHD in the medical field that date from 1775 with Dr. Melchior, I don't always forget the surname, and also Dr. Sir Alexander Crichton, a Scottish doctor, so in 1798, who also described ADHD, so around the same time period. And they described it as this tendency to get distracted, to be very emotional, very sensitive, and very hyperactive, especially in children. And these descriptions also were a lot earlier than TikTok or Instagram or Big Pharma or whatever people think that ADHD is caused from, right? So we have evidence that it existed way before today. Now, why would the environment also play a role? Because, well, ADHD is polygenic, so it's a very complex genotype. It's a very complex phenotype in general, in biological terms, which means that
Can you break that down? Oh, great. You're going to break it down for people.
There are several genes that are going to come into play when it comes to ADHD. So you can have ADHD because your dopamine system is understimulated, but that can come because some genes that code for the absorption of dopamine in the gut are disrupted, or maybe because some genes that code for receptors of dopamine in neurons are disrupted, or for neuron formation, or for that thing, or for that other thing. So at the end of the day, you end up with a combination of 100 to 150 genes already that just these ones can explain ADHD, and then you have the mutations and the combination of all of that. So it's a mess, right?
Well, and it's why it's so hard to diagnose genetically speaking. Like people are like, why can't we just test the genes and know? And because it's very complex. Hopefully in our lifetime we'll understand more. But because of the complexity, I wouldn't be surprised if it's a few generations out before we really start to be able to dial it in.
Exactly. There's a recent study that actually identified 27 genes. But for example, there was one that is dopamine receptor, another one is serotonin, another one is adrenaline. So each person may have a different origin of ADHD, but that has at the end of the day a convergent phenotype, which means that the result will be the same, but because of different stuff, right? And then you have the environment that comes in and that can influence this and activate or deactivate certain genetic predispositions and make it more likely that your brain is going to develop in certain ways. To give a simple comparison, it's like you have people who have very white skin and people who have a bit of Mediterranean skin. If they both go under the sun, one of them is going to get burned in 10 minutes and the other not, right? And it's not because only the environment, is just a kind of weird interaction between the two things.
Yeah. And what you're talking about is epigenetics. So we've got the genes, which are coded, and then we've got the way that the environment influences the genetic expression, how those genes are actually going to present, to show up, to express themselves. And that's where I think it is an important conversation. So I'm glad that you said that, because I'm like, I definitely teed it up in that way, because ADHD has always been around as far as we know. And yet our current environment isn't really compatible with the ADHD brain. I would love to hear more of that from you. One thing I'll say is really the capitalistic drive of work 8 hours straight through, or even you look at the school system. Sit all of this time. You only get breaks when we say you get breaks. That entire system is really set up for profitability. It benefits other people, not the individual. And it's an entire system that says this idea that neurotypical is the standard. Why is it the standard? Because it's the one that makes the most profit in this society. And so that's just one example. I would love for you to speak more about how is our environment influencing the ADHD brain?
I mean, that's definitely a fascinating question, because it's still being studied and it's still not very well understood. But, for example, you talked about epigenetics, but besides epigenetics, it can be also just an interaction, right? You have a genetic predispositions that make certain traits more likely to appear. And then you have an environment that also makes certain traits more likely to appear. So if you have these traits being ADHD and they're up to a certain point, and then you add the environment to that, then you might go over the clinical threshold and you have the apparition of symptoms of ADHD, which get disruptive. Remove the environment and you don't have clinical ADHD, even though you have these traits. Remove genetics, but put the environment, you have the same that's happening. So you already have these kind of interactions. What you say about the capitalistic society, the 8 hours a day, I mean, humans were not meant for that, right?
Never.
We have evolved as a species for 200,000 years to be the most resilient hunters in the animal world, right? We managed to survive and to catch prey because we would manage to outlast them into long running things, right? We're not as fast, but we can just run for much longer. We are made to be in movement. And today we get to a society where nobody is moving. Everyone is in front of a computer 8 hours a day. And whoever you are, whether you have ADHD or not, that's not going to be fantastic for your mental health. It's just that when you have ADHD on top of this, or when you have certain genetic predispositions, this kind of environment will make everything so much more worse. It will disproportionately affect you. And that's one part. The other part is that, for example, very, very recent studies actually showed that microplastics in the form of bisphenol A, more specifically, can alter certain neurochemical pathways and induce more ADHD-like symptoms by disrupting how neurons form themselves during critical periods, such as in newborns or even in the womb. So there's these kind of chemical environment, physical environment, social environment that are all nefarious for mental health, that all increase the likelihood of having issues such as anxiety and depression, and make life extremely harder for people who already are neurodivergent and who are not adapted to this way of working, which is crazy. I mean, if you took a medieval peasant and you told him, instead of working 150 days a year, you have to work 300 and do it for 8 hours a day, seated down without going out ever, they would tell you you're crazy. It's
Well, and I'm glad that you brought up the plastics, the environmental toxins. We know that it's so crazy to me how there's one camp that's like, we're 100% science, and, we push back against that. And these things are not so bad. And yet we have to consider the totality of the exposure. So working in women's health, we know that women have a huge exposure to environmental toxins through their personal care products. They're, wearing like 10 to 13 products a day that may be, over and over exposing them to the same chemical. No one's ever done that study. No one's ever looked at, okay, not just like the amount of phthalates or, whatever the chemical that you're looking at, not just how much is actually in this product, but how much is in every single product. And then you wear it over a period of time. And then you continue to wear it while you're also pregnant. And then there's all the other things in our environment that we cannot dodge, that we cannot avoid. And, as you bring up microplastics, BPA, there's the effect on the brain, then there's also the effect on the hormones. And we know, I really, Dr. Mascani, who's a great researcher in menopausal brains, she does great publications on that. Something that she said is the biggest mistake we ever made is calling them sex hormones, because they're not. They're just hormones and they're all over. And that's what she talks about in brain health, is that because we called them sex hormones, we called them women's sex hormones, it became all about the pelvis, all about the ovaries. Can you make a baby? Maybe the breasts get involved. And we left behind the brain. And that, I think, is also important for people to understand, because as women who are neurodivergent, we are very, very sensitive to the hormonal changes across our menstrual cycle, during perimenopause, pregnancy, postpartum. As you enter menopause, we see a lot of changes happening. And so we also have to consider, what is the environment doing to our hormones? How is that interacting with our ADHD as well?
Absolutely. I mean, estrogen, testosterone even plays a huge role into the expression of ADHD. You have studies showing that I think it was 49% of women with ADHD are prone to have PMDD, right? Which is, for listeners who don't know who that is, it's a premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is basically PMS, but bad. Like really bad.
Really bad.
Yeah, with suicidal thoughts, with really, low energy, exhaustion. You're feeling horrible for certain days, way worse than PMS. And 49% of women with ADHD are prone to that. More women with ADHD are prone to have postpartum depression. A lot of women find out they have ADHD whenever they have a child or whenever they hit menopause, because that's when their hormones get lower, right? So definitely the environment that affects hormones will also affect how ADHD symptoms express themselves, and also how manageable they become. Because something that I really like to say is that you can have ADHD, and having ADHD and suffering from ADHD are two different things.
Yeah.
You can have the symptoms, you can have the traits, but if they're managed, if they're accommodated, they don't necessarily make you suffer. Suffering from it implies a whole other level of understanding with the interactions that it has on your body and mind.
I want to just add to this conversation for people listening. PMDD, so PMS, we might experience 3 to 5 days before we get our period. PMDD is going to be a longer period of time. So what we currently understand, and it's not complete truth for everyone, is post-ovulation. That is when progesterone is rising. The only way to get progesterone is through ovulation. And when that spikes around 5 to 7 days post-ovulation, that's when the PMDD symptoms can heighten. So this might be more like a week and a half to even 2 weeks of your cycle. And so for people to understand, you have to track your symptoms. If you are feeling emotional, you are raging, you are, finding that you are suicidal, if you have major joint pain, muscle aches, you feel like you have the flu, these kinds of symptoms are all important to write down, because we have to see these symptoms consistently over several month period of time to make that diagnosis. And often, why I say it's not true for everybody is because often the therapy is to shut down ovulation by using hormonal birth control. However, hormonal birth control contains no progesterone, it contains progestin. We know that certain individuals, and the research has not been done to the extent it should be for how long we've had the pill, on who is most susceptible to developing depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, which is the suicidal thoughts. And yet I do see women with PMDD who also have ADHD or are autistic. Autistic women are at even higher risk of PMDD. They'll be put on the pill and things get so much worse. And I believe it's so much to do with that progestin as well. So sometimes we have to play with the progesterone. There's different things that need to be done, but I want people to understand that if this is you, do not delay getting that diagnosis, getting support, because as you said, you shouldn't have to suffer. You mentioned accommodations. What kind of accommodations have maybe helped you or that you found has helped your clients?
That's a very broad question. Could you, maybe point that towards an area of life like work, home, the relationships, because there's like so much to say.
There is so much to say. Gosh, as much as I want to start with relationships. Let's start there. I think that a lot of people are going to be interested in that.
I would say, this might sound like a very boring advice, but I swear it's going to get better. To start with self-awareness, right? When you're aware of how you react, of how you are, and of what makes you tick, what puts you into distress, it becomes a lot easier to navigate all sorts of relationship. And the second step, of course, is communicating these things. And one very easy tip that I want to give everyone here, feel free to use it, saved a lot of relationships around me, is just to kind of monitor your internal state by just giving it a color, right? Just give it either green, orange, or red, where green is you're fine, you're okay, everything is great, and you can even have some unexpected things happening and you're going to, handle them fantastically. Then you have orange, which is you need to do the bare minimum. You can function, you can work, you can do your routines, but you don't need anything else more on your plate, because otherwise you will either shut down or be overwhelmed or, be in deep distress. And then red is don't talk to me, don't do anything with me, do not interact, because I am being in complete distress right now, right? And these are kind of the three main levels. Then people can add, yellow or whatever they want in there, but these are the three main ones. And whenever you start your day, kind of just, do a short body scan and be like, okay, in which color am I in today? And just by communicating that color with your partner or with your friends or with your family, it makes a lot of interactions a lot less painful, because by then, if you know that I'm in an orange day, you're not going to bring up a very heavy topic or something that will overwhelm me, because you know that the conversation is not going to go well. So you'll just leave it on the side, make sure that I am well hydrated and well fed and well rested, and then we'll talk about it in the morning. And usually that works very well. Just that one simple change creates a space where people, first of all, listen to each other, but are also aware of each other's limitations. So that's the one biggest tip that will change a lot of interactions for sure.
I love coming up with a color-coded system. I'm going to implement that with my children. I think that is a really powerful way to communicate it with my oldest, who he's very verbal, very intellectual. Like he will say, I'm dysregulated right now. I'm dysregulated. I'm like, okay, move the body, space, just tell me what you need. We have those kinds of conversations, but I think starting the day with assessing what's the baseline. And if you already know your baseline is orange and then you hit high traffic, or there's something else that kind of pushes you over the edge, the anticipation, and I don't want to say anticipation, but maybe the recognition that the possibility of red is lingering gives you an opportunity to give yourself permission to maybe take a 10-minute walk, to do a deep breathing session, to maybe squeeze the hell out of your stress ball, whatever it is for you that helps you, to go back to what you were saying about we were meant to run, we are hunters. I think that is such a big evolutionary mismatch that we have right now in our society, is that when we have these kind of big emotions or our nervous system is feeling dysregulated, we're in that fight or flight. So often it's just take a breath. There's socially acceptable ways, especially as women, I even do my little prim and proper hands, that we should process those things. And I actually tell a patient sometimes, maybe you want to do jump squats. Maybe you want to sprint down the hall in your office, because what your body is saying is that in the fight or flight, it's fight, flight, freeze. What do you want to do here? Because your body doesn't care that you're sitting in an office. Your body doesn't care that you're in the carpool line. Your body doesn't care. Your body needs what it needs. How can we move that in an effective, positive way?
Yeah, your body needs release, and it needs to release that nervous energy. That is absolutely 100% sure. And something else also that can help a lot of people is music.
Yeah.
works super well with ADHD. Also, a study on kids, right? So maybe not everyone as an adult will have the same experience, but a study in kids showed that children with ADHD actually read better and are better concentrated when they listen to music rather than when they don't have music. And neurotypical children is the opposite. When there's silence, they can concentrate. When there's music, they can concentrate less. So just integrating music into your life can make a huge change. It also channels your emotions. And with ADHD, I've made a post about that recently about emotion contagion. We tend to get attuned to the emotions of other people. And with emotional dysregulation, you amplify them. So if everyone around you is feeling stressed, you may have a panic attack that doesn't even come from your own anxieties. And that can be very difficult to handle. If you have noise-canceling headphones and you pop on, I don't know, Taylor Swift song or heavy metal, then suddenly you're in your own bubble. And that helps a lot with emotion regulation.
It's one of my tricks for flying because so many people have anxiety about flying. I have more anxiety about like, is everybody going to get in the line and are we going to go single file and will everybody follow the rules of putting their back? Like there's rules and I'm like, that's what I'm anxious about. Of like, will everybody know the rules and we can all move faster? But I have to put on music because it's if the person next to me is like freaking out, then I start freaking out and I'm like, and I always am like, is it me or is it them? It's always them. And so music is absolutely something that I want to echo. The other thing is binaural beats. That can be super helpful as well. With my son, we like when he was really young, we read to go to sleep, but sometimes he would have that nervous energy. And sound bath is something that even now he'll still request. Like, can we put that on? I love the music tip. And when you said about music and studying, I'm like, no, that was me. I actually find that if I will listen to the same song on repeat over and over and over, or for different sections that I'm studying. And then when I would go to take the test, I would just sing that song and I'd be able to recall it. And my brain's like, there it is. We've got that for you. And when I would share that with people, they're like, you are such a freak. And I'm like, a freak with an A.
I did the same. I had specific bands or albums that I would associate to certain, to certain things. And then before the test, I would re-listen again to that same album and I would ace the test.
Yeah.
Exactly the same.
Okay, so what were your bands? What were your albums? Because I'm just curious.
I think for biochemistry, it was a heavy metal album of Disturbed. I've listened to Linkin Park for, I think it was Animal Biology, and then I don't remember the others, but it was around the same kind of vibe.
Yeah.
But yeah, I had specific bands for certain themes, and that worked.
Yeah, no, I did the same thing. Okay, so same. I love that. I've actually never heard anyone else say that. So I'm like really excited right now that I'm like, this is amazing. See, we were supposed to talk. This is so great. Oh, yeah. I want to go though a little bit further because we talked about, you can be taking on somebody else's anxiety. You can be picking up someone else's emotions. But does ADHD itself cause anxiety? Is there an association with anxiety?
There is an association with anxiety. So more people with ADHD will have anxiety. Now, whether it's the ADHD itself that creates the anxiety or it's because you're more prone to anxiety when you have ADHD, right, it's still very unclear. And the lab conditions to test that would be very unethical. So we can't know. But probably the thing is that with ADHD, you have emotional dysregulation. And then, you're prone to distractions, to hyperactivity, and to a lot more criticism. So it would make sense that someone who's constantly criticized more than other people would develop more anxiety than other people. It's not surprising.
Yeah. I think that is something, that's one of the things that often women will be diagnosed with is anxiety. And when you unpack it, there's often ADHD underlying that. You brought up the hyperactivity, though. I want to talk about that because everybody thinks like, oh, if you have ADHD, you must be bouncing off the walls. You must be like running around. You can't sit still. You're fidgeting all the time. Break that down for us.
ADHD is more a difficulty of regulating things, right? It's a deficit in executive functions. And executive functions, they do regulate things like attention, which is why we have attention issues. They regulate emotions. They regulate prioritization, organization, all this kind of stuff. And also movement, and also how nervous you are. But how you will express this hyperactivity depends from person to person. It's been shown that males, for example, tend to express more their hyperactive side when they become teenagers, because there's an increase in testosterone, you have an increase in energy, and so if you have more energy, you're going to move more. But then there's also all the social pressures on girls, even, starting from babies, to sit still, to be quiet, to not make
let me
wave.
do my
And so you kind of,
prim and proper
exactly.
hands.
And so you kind of just internalize all of those pressures, and all of the hyperactivity and nervousness that you have inside of you, can just push it deep down, and you become inattentive. And so the hyperactivity becomes mental. You just have incredible worlds inside of your mind that are absolutely immense, but then from the outside, you just look like this.
Yeah.
Perfectly still. And so the intense activity that is going on inside your mind is never seen from the outside. The only thing that is seen is that you might not respond when people call you, or you might be getting a bit distracted, but it's actually because the brain is never stopping. It's sending you all of these signals constantly, all of the time. So there's, in general, right, to get back a bit to the basics, there's 3 presentations of ADHD: inattentive, which is what I just said. Then there is hyperactive, which is people running around all the time and being super physical. And then there's mixed presentation, which is the most predominant presentation for people. 70% will be mixed. And then you'll have about 15 and 15% of people who will be on each side of the spectrum. And the thing is that this presentation could also change throughout life. If you become more energized, or if you go through a burnout, right? And maybe you were hyperactive, you go through a burnout, bam, you become inattentive because you simply don't have the energy to move.
Yeah.
It has a lot to do with energy, with hormones, as also you fantastically said before, when you explained that whole thing. It was beautiful to listen to, honestly.
Well, thank you.
No, but it's true, right? And the presentations can change. So it is a bit complex. You will have different presentations. I think I went out of my way to answer that, but that's fine.
No, I think it's great that you broke down how people typically present, knowing that mixed is part of it. And this is where I think women really face a challenge in getting a diagnosis, is that there's a couple things that I often hear or I've read in other chart notes. One is patient sits still the entire time, does not fidget, all of these things. And it's like the doctor doesn't realize that this person is masking, they're performing, they are doing their best to give you exactly what you want, and behave accordingly. And then the other thing that often will come up is that, well, this person was able to finish their degree. This person has a PhD. Therefore, they could never have ADHD because they're successful. And so much of what you said, I think, is going to resonate with people, but I would just love to have you speak to that piece as well.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of treatment by doctors is honestly always something that makes me a bit mad, also because it resonates to my own experience and the experience of a lot of people who are close to me and who, because of this kind of mistreatment, have, risked losing their life. So it is definitely something that is very close to me. No, you can definitely be successful with ADHD. It has nothing to do with that. And you can be successful because of a number of parameters or of things. If you were born in a fantastic family with perfect education and everyone is rich and all your needs were always accommodated, then you can have ADHD and be perfectly fine and be extremely successful because all of the usual challenges will never be presented to you. So, for example, that can be just the environment. You can have a naturally high IQ that will compensate for your ADHD symptoms. You're super smart. Everything that you learn, you immediately remember it. And so you need to pay attention 5 minutes in class instead of 50. And that also works with ADHD, right? Because you will pay attention for a bit of time, but if you imprint everything right away, you can still be super successful at school without even doing any effort. There's people who I know who just worked 3 times harder than everyone else and who have PhDs today. Right? They just spent 3 hours doing homework instead of 1 every day. And so they just exhausted themselves to the point of burnout to get to that level. And I think that whenever you do that, whenever you work, whenever you overcome your ADHD in those ways, you end up, even without wanting to, learning tools that will help you whenever things get challenging. So you can definitely come very far with ADHD because you will use overcompensatory mechanisms. You have also other people that will self-medicate with coffee or with tobacco, smoking 40 cigarettes a day just to get by. You can finish a degree, but your lungs will be, gone. There's plenty of reasons why people with ADHD can be successful, or even just because they have adapted their own life. You have studies showing that people with ADHD have a higher entrepreneurial profile. They're more likely to start their own companies and not more or less likely to fail or succeed.
Yeah.
Right?
It's funny because so many years ago I had said, I'm just not good at being someone else's employee. I'm just not good at that. I have to work for myself. I also have the problem of don't like to be told what to do. I'm if you sign my paycheck, okay, maybe. But that's also something I think people with ADHD can really relate to, is being oppositional and being a little combative sometimes when you feel like someone's being overly demanding on you.
There's definitely that. There's, lots of studies on the overlap between ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder, just opposition behavior by itself, which makes sense because whenever you have ADHD, most of your negative feedback will come from authority figures like teachers, parents, or whoever you have in front of you at that time. So having constant negative feedback from a type of position will not foster trust and love towards these kind of positions. If you're constantly told that you're not good, that you're not enough, or you have opportunities that were barred to you by these kind of figures, then you end up resenting them, just automatically, because you learned that authority means danger. You never learned that authority means trust or safety. You just learned that whoever is above you has the power to make your life miserable, because that's what happened during your life. And so it becomes very difficult. And some people take it to insane extremes, which is where oppositional defiant disorder comes in, and they refuse to get health treatments. They cut ties with their parents, not because of abuse or whatever. They just cut ties with their parents because that's it. And I don't know, it just creates a whole load of problems once this goes out of control. But a lot of it is due to the environment. And if people were just a bit better educated about what ADHD is and how to treat children who have that, there would be a lot less opposition.
And when you talk about learning this, so many of us are learning this in childhood, which really gets ingrained. It's the way we start laying down our neurons as well. And so it's possible. We know the brain is amazing to unlearn these things, to make these changes. But if you're someone listening to this and you're like, yes, I get triggered in this way, awareness is really one of the first steps, wouldn't you say?
It's absolutely one of the first steps. Awareness, for me, the fact of learning that you have ADHD, even just self-diagnosing, is a step towards awareness, because it's a step towards understanding yourself. And once you have that kind of key in hand, everything becomes so much easier, because especially with ADHD, we have trouble recognizing our emotions. We have trouble recognizing even the signals of our bodies, like thirst or hunger. And so being aware of what to look out for goes a very long way into making life better. And this also applies, of course, to emotional scars or trauma.
Speak to why it is that people with ADHD have a hard time staying, aware of their need to drink water, to eat food. They often lose track of where they're at in the day in terms of caring for their body.
Right. So a lot of it, I think, comes to cognitive load. There is just a certain amount of information that your brain is able to process at a time. And when you have ADHD and you have a very wide array of attention, you tend to pick up all possible signals that are around you in your environment, but also all kinds of internal signals, which includes thoughts that can be about anything, and signals that can also be about anything. So, your shirt is a bit tight, or your pants don't fit quite right, or your head is scratching. And this comes to par with signals like I'm thirsty, I'm hungry, I'm tired.
Yeah.
And then you have all of the thoughts. And you kind of have all of this massive information that comes into a small bottleneck, which is your working memory. And you can process really only 7 to 9 at a time of these signals. And when you have so much to filter through, the important information, which is, hunger, thirst, and all the physiological signals, they kind of just get lost into it. It's as if I put full volume 5 televisions open right in your room, and then I told you to pay attention to what I'm saying. Would be a lot harder. Some of it would come through. Most of it probably wouldn't.
What can people do so that they can better nourish themselves, they can stay hydrated, they can stay on top of these body needs?
So I would say there's 2 main things that people can do. The first one is intentionally focusing their attention towards their bodies. Doing a 2-minute body scan per day. You just kind of sit on your chair or wherever you are, you close your eyes, you're like, okay, how am I feeling? Am I tired? Am I hungry? Is, my stomach gurgling? Do I need to drink water? Do I need to lie down? Do I need to sleep? That's it. Just ask yourself these questions actively and consciously. This will direct your attention towards these points in your body, and you usually will find the answers. Do I need to go to the bathroom? Lots of people with ADHD have UTI because they forget to go to the bathroom. These kind of things. So actively focusing your attention. And the second thing that you can do is just implementing routines. So if you have regular routines of bathroom or eating or drinking times, you kind of don't even need to go through that intentional awareness step, because you know that you will have breakfast at this time, lunch at this time, dinner at this time. So your body will be fed throughout the day, and you will have had also your share of hydration throughout the day. And maybe a third kind of small tip that I could say is buy yourself a nice bottle that is shiny and that you like, because that definitely helps a lot.
Facts. Oh, and I have to tell you that, so I'm like neurotic about, like literally about tracking my water. I won't even let my husband, if I have like a bottle of sparkling water, I'm like, you can't have that. I have to know how many ounces, how many mils I got in a day. But the water bottle trick of a water bottle that you love, it's your new accessory. Just keep it with you. And for some people, even getting one that has a straw, you need to clean this often, everyone. You need to clean it often, please. But the one with the straw will make it even easier for some people. Or adding in, electrolytes, berries, things that can flavor the water as well. Things that make it fun, that switch it up. Because when I tell you water can be so boring, it is so boring you don't want to drink it. It's so boring. And so that's where I'm like, get fancy. Make your spa water at home. Like, it doesn't just have to be like the citrus fruit. Like, you put strawberries in there, put cucumbers in there, like put melons, like, mix it up, make it so it's not boring. And
if you feel fancy, drink tea.
Yeah. If you feel fancy, you're in Europe. You're like, if you're British, if you feel fancy, drink some tea. So I want to talk a little bit more about comorbidities and ADHD. We've talked about PMDD. We've talked about anxiety. But with the you just gave me, I think we have a lot more to unpack when it comes to the comorbidities of ADHD. Break it down for us.
Oh boy, that's a whole other Pandora's box to go through, right? So there's a number of comorbidities. I think you have the physical ones. You will have a huge comorbidity with joint issues like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or hypermobility. So a lot of people with ADHD will have joint hypermobility. Then you will have also a lot of people with ADHD who will have fibromyalgia, which is an immune system dysregulation. So that comes along with chronic pain, chronic fatigue, with also dizziness when you stand up, with POTS as well. I don't remember exactly what what the acronym means, but it was complicated. And then you will have also a lot of I'm sorry about this.
No, it's okay.
Brain is scrambled.
It's okay. And most people just refer to it as POTS. And so I think what's more helpful is to understand the symptoms of POTS.
Yeah.
So you stand up, you get dizzy. Sometimes you, as simply as walking to the bathroom and your heart rate elevates. You have exercise intolerance. And that is something that we also see a lot with people who developed long COVID, which is interesting because there's a lot of crossover with some of these ADHD symptoms and long COVID. And so I bring that up just because it's another one of those things that when you're like, I think I might have ADHD, working with a knowledgeable practitioner can help you sort that out. There's no reason you can't have both. No one ever said you can't have multiple things going on at once.
Yeah, you can definitely have a lot of things going on at once. And postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. It's basically when your heart goes bonkers whenever you do something.
Yes.
Absolutely. And that is usually linked to widespread chronic inflammation, which is also linked to ADHD, which is also linked to fibromyalgia, which is also linked to a number of other mental conditions. And indeed, to long COVID as well. As you said, I've loved that you brought this subject because actually people with ADHD are also more likely to get long COVID and to suffer from it. And recently, there's been some promising studies with interventions with ashwagandha, B12, and vagus nerve stimulation that all decrease the symptoms of long COVID, and also an enzyme called serratiopeptidase. That comes from the stomach of a silkworm and is still very much difficult to extract, but they all brought, promising results. So if you're listening to that, go look into these if you can.
So I have to share. We're going to go more in comorbidities, but I got COVID in 2020 and I didn't really have any symptoms. I just one day couldn't breathe and passed out going to the bathroom, and I was an anomaly. And then I ended up with long COVID, and I spent 4 months on oxygen. I had POTS. I trigeminal neuralgia. And majority of my symptoms were neurological and cardiovascular. I've never had a fever, never had a cough. Lungs, imaging after imaging, all perfectly clear. And it was interesting because people were either like, you're faking it or you're malingering. And all of these experts online, because suddenly everybody was an expert on COVID, even though it just stepped onto the scene. That was very laughable. I had medical doctors who were like, you either have diabetes or you had cardiovascular disease. I'm like, So my 2020 plan was to travel the world. And so I had a complete workup just before I got COVID and everything was perfect. They were like, you look amazing. I'm like, yay. And then I got so sick. And it's something that as I go through the research, I'm like, there's being neurodivergent, there is having autoimmune disease, there's having endometriosis, and all of these have a histamine component to them as well, which, as we were talking about PMDD, that can also have a histamine component. And so it's fascinating to me how all of these things are connected and how we still don't even understand who all was affected by COVID and why they were affected so significantly. But also just, even when we look at fibromyalgia, who is most likely to get that? Is that even the best diagnosis we could be giving someone? Because is there anything else underlying that maybe you just haven't read the study on yet to be able to help that person?
I just absolutely agree with everything you just said. It's just the research is so recent and so complicated that it's very difficult to come to conclusions. And at the end of the day, whether it's ADHD or everything else, there's also a lot of categorization that is going on. So at some point, if we discover something else, the categorization may change.
Yeah. Let's keep going with comorbidities. We took a little detour, but there's so many comorbidities. I'm like, we're going to deviate and I'll bring us back in.
I would say maybe the first and foremost that people should know about is likely sleep issues, insomnia, and just sleep problems overall with ADHD. So 80% of people with ADHD report having sleep issues, which is either not managing to get to sleep at night, just staying in bed and tossing and turning for 3 hours and not being able to close your eyes, or just waking up completely exhausted in the morning and not being able to get out of bed. And that was me for a lot of years. And it turns out that a lot of people with ADHD have what is called delayed sleep phase syndrome. So just the hormones that normally react to sunlight, like melatonin and cortisol, just basically onsets 1 hour to 1 hour and a half later. than they normally should, just like teenagers, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
And then a lot of people also just generally have insomnia because the mental hyperactivity that you have all the time just prevents you to get into that kind of rest state to be able to sleep. And a lot of people with ADHD actually have sleep apnea, which is something that not a lot of people know. So sleep apnea is basically when you can have obstructive sleep apnea or not obstructive, but most people with ADHD, it's obstructive, which means that your airways are obstructed by something, which can be something as simple as a deviation of your septum, or your tongue is too big, whatever, right? But your airways are obstructed. That means that whenever you sleep at night, you micro-suffocate at times. You can't manage to breathe. And so your brain wakes you up to kind of make you breathe, but this also disrupts your sleep cycle. And since the moment during sleep when you recover energies, slow wave sleep, you get out of slow wave constantly and you don't get back there, which means that your sleep pressure is not relieved, that your memory consolidation is absolute crap, and also probably that all the plasticity things that should be happening during slow wave, like activation of genes like BDNF or ZIF268, also get disrupted, which kind of just perpetuates the cycle. And that sucks, right? And the thing is that there are treatments available for sleep apnea. There are things that people can do. And just by, going to the doctor and getting tested for that, that can just cancel a lot of your problems with exhaustion, for example.
I want to go back. The genes you mentioned, what are they and why they're so important?
So the BDNF and ZIF268, they're usually implied in memory and especially in brain plasticity. So they are the ones that are going to be responsible for the rearranging of neurons and synapses in the brain. They are the ones that are going to make you able to be flexible in what you learn and in how you do things. When you will have less BDNF, your synapses become less flexible, which means that your network become more rigidified and you can have increased, for example, emotional responses. You have a harder time learning things. You have a harder time consolidating memories. All of these things can happen with the decreased plasticity. And with the ZIF, it's more or less the same.
This all sounds really bad. Let's give people some solutions. What can people do to start to improve their sleep?
So to improve their sleep, a couple of things that I've seen work in a lot of people is having a regular sleep schedule. And I know that sounds boring as hell for a lot of people with ADHD, but it works, right? Because it kind of just...
All the stuff that works is boring.
Unfortunately it is, but it kind of just forces your body and your hormones to be, to start rising at the appropriate times. So go to bed and wake up every day at the same time, just every day, even weekends, even holidays. And that does sound boring as hell, but after a couple of months, you start seeing changes and you start waking up more refreshed because just your body gets used to that rhythm. And so what we call your sleep pressure cycle that is created by adenosine and your circadian rhythm become synchronized. Because when they are unsynchronized, instead what happens, and a lot of people are going to relate to this, is that you feel exhausted as hell during the day, you feel sleepy, the only thing you can think of is going to bed, then you go to bed, it's 10, and suddenly you're wide awake and you want to start 10,000 projects. This is what happens when they're unsynchronized. Synchronizing them makes sure that when you go to bed, you're sleepy. Second very easy thing, only sleep in your bed. It's a very simple phenomenon called context-dependent memory. You tend to associate places with actions or things. So associate your bed with sleep. After a while, whenever you go to bed, you feel more sleepy. And the third thing that I would advise is honestly just take melatonin. Jumpstarts the whole thing. It works very well and has very little side effects.
Okay, as a brain expert, you got to talk a little more about melatonin because there are people who are so afraid of it. I hear as well, people will say, like, if you are giving your child melatonin, it is child abuse. And this is something where I'm like, tell me you don't have a neurodivergent child without telling me, because sometimes children, with ADHD, autism, pandas, certain conditions, they need to have that melatonin. It's not just going to help them fall asleep, but it's also an antioxidant for the brain. It has a lot of utility. But people are so afraid that they're going to become addicted to melatonin. Can you speak to that?
No, melatonin is just basically the hormones that make you fall asleep. It's the one that controls your circadian rhythm. And that's it, right? You cannot even overdose on melatonin. If you take too much of it, it just will have the opposite effect, so you won't sleep. That's it. Big deal. No offense.
You're already not sleeping, but if you need sleep, maybe that is a big deal.
The thing is that melatonin seems to be less effective in people who are autistic in certain forms, because certain forms of autism, some people have an increased number of synapses, increased brain activity. So in these forms of autism, people will have up to 30 to 40% more synapses, which means that the degree of melatonin that is required to put these neurons to sleep is increased, which is why whenever sleep experts prescribe melatonin to autistic people, they usually prescribe higher doses than they do to neurotypical people. It's not child abuse to give your child melatonin. It just will help them sleep better. That's it. It's just the sleep hormone. It's nothing weird. It's nothing fancy. I mean, it's just the sleep hormone.
And it's something that I want people to understand. We always want to work on our sleep hygiene. Like you were saying, making sure that you go to bed at the same time, sleeping in a completely dark room, making sure your room is cool, making sure your sheets are comfortable. The sensory processing issues can be real with like your bed just being uncomfortable, like the sheets are scratchy, the pillow. Like, you do have to tend to all of that. And you may also need additional support. So I do like things like phosphatidylserine, passion flower, and I think melatonin has utility as well because, we use it often. So if you have endometriosis, if you are struggling with fertility, that's something that we may be using more like, 3, 6, 12 milligrams of melatonin. If you're wanting to go to sleep, some people, they have 0.5 milligrams of melatonin and they're like, I'm out for the night. And when it comes to children, it really is something that you don't want a paradoxical effect. More is not better. We do want to instill good sleep habits, but at the same time, if your child is neurotypical or has a different issue going on that's affecting their sleep, understand that the poor quality sleep is one of the most damaging things. It really will inhibit your body's ability to heal. And so sometimes we do need to use it short term. Sometimes you're in a healing phase that is longer, that you're using it long term. I think really the slippery slope is when people are like, we're not doing, bedtime routine with our kid. We're just going to give them melatonin when we're done with them at the end of the day and call it that. And that's a different conversation. And really, I haven't met any parents who are doing that.
No, exactly. And also something you mentioned is that the environment needs to be also kind of tailored, right? If you use melatonin, but I don't know, you live in a neighborhood and you have a train passing by your window every 5 minutes, then melatonin is not going to help because it's the environment that sucks. Getting a good mattress, having a good pillow, having good sheets, all of that is amazing advice. And also something that is generally advised is also to sleep in a room that is slightly colder than what you would usually be in, because your body decreases its temperature during night, and so you tend to feel warmer if the temperature of your room is too warm, and that can trigger other things like sleep paralysis, which is really not fun.
What is that? Explain that to people.
Sleep paralysis is basically when you're awake but you're dreaming at the same time. So whenever you dream, your brain area that's called the thalamus kind of paralyzes your muscles, and when it doesn't, you sleepwalk. So it prevents you from moving during your dreams. And the thing is that you become awake during this phase, you're still paralyzed and you're still dreaming, so you kind of have extremely weird hallucinations while you see your room, which is usually dark. And since dreams often work by auto-completing what your emotions and consciousness sees, you're scared, you're in a dark room, you're going to auto-complete with nightmares. And so you basically see this kind of nightmarish hallucinations and demons that are coming to eat your soul, but you're just sleeping. It's a really not fun experience. I've
very
lived it many
specific.
times. I've lived it many times.
I have also experienced this, and it's the worst. It's also something too that one time I just have to share that it was my husband cheating, and I could not snap out of that. I was like, it happened. I saw it. It happened. And even though I'm like, I know it didn't really happen, but like that my brain was really trying to like reconcile like what was going on. And I do want to add, so people, whenever I share on social media that when I go to a hotel, I'll drop the temp of the room to like 64, if that's Fahrenheit. People are like, that's crazy. Why would you do that? I'm like, because I already have a hard time sleeping in hotel rooms. And if I get it super cold and I go take a warm shower and then it's super cold when I come out and I get in bed, like my body will just be like, go to sleep. You're done.
Yeah, the temperature changes can help as well.
Okay, so we've covered the hypermobility, we've covered POTS, we've covered sleep issues, PMDD. Is there anything else that you think people should be aware of when it comes to comorbidities?
Plenty of things, right? We have a lot to choose from. I mean,
maybe
we
you
have
give us a
increased-
rapid fire list. We could pick the best ones to pick apart.
There's a higher rate of comorbidity with, of course, depression and anxiety. You know, you struggle your whole life. That makes sense. Then there's also higher comorbidity with autism. There's a high comorbidity with bipolar disorder, with OCD, a bit higher with Tourette's as well. So there's a comorbidity with a number of other issues and disorders, oppositional defiant disorder as well, which I mentioned earlier. And yeah, those would be the main ones that come to mind. Oh, and eating disorders.
Yeah, definitely. And the reason why I wanted to bring up this list is because if you're someone who has been diagnosed with these things and there's aspects of ADHD that you're like, I wonder, it may be worth exploring and seeing, like, do you also have ADHD? You brought up autism, and that is one that a high number of autistics, like more than half, in some of the research, maybe you have different statistics based on the research that you have been reading, also have ADHD. And that is something that I feel like we really aren't doing a good enough job of really separating who is truly just ADHD and who is autistic also with ADHD. You know, you said it the opposite way of like ADHD is the comorbidity of autism. Really, they're just like besties hanging out. They're just like hanging out together. You know, in terms of, you know, how many people do you think with ADHD are actually autistic that we're missing?
So this is interesting, and it will change a lot and as a function of how you formulate it, right? Around 50% of people with autism will meet the diagnostic criteria for specifically inattentive ADHD. And some studies say that a lot of that comes from the fact that there are just simply overlapping criteria. That if you're autistic and you struggle with social interactions or eye contact, then you might also come off as inattentive ADHD. It doesn't necessarily mean you are, though. So a lot of that at the end of the day also comes to personal experience. And I will encourage people who are autistic or people who are ADHD to go and look at the lived experiences of patients who have been diagnosed with ADHD or who have been diagnosed with autism and see if they relate to any of that. Because the diagnostic criteria are one thing, and they are sometimes quite far away from what the reality of the lived experience is. And this, I feel, is a first quite important distinction. The second thing is that studies show that between 20 and 60% of people with ADHD also meet the criteria for autism. And the reason why it's such a huge difference is because as a function of the methods the studies used, then you will have either the lower percentage or the higher one. And so far, there is still a lot of research ongoing on that, so it's very difficult to weigh on one way or another, but I would really encourage people to go and look at the lived experiences of people, because it can teach you a lot about yourself, and you can find maybe struggles that you have that are not quite fully explained by ADHD. And so that's an interesting part. And If at the end of the day you don't relate, then that's fine. You will have learned something about someone else and probably will have more compassion towards them. So that's, win-win either way.
Yeah. Well, I love you saying, look at the lived experiences, because the data of living in your body and your own life is so, so valuable. And I think there's not enough humility in medicine for practitioners to recognize that the research on autism and ADHD is so far behind where it should be, especially when you look at those who were born with ovaries, and how and why I say that, people are always like, why don't you just say woman? Well, very specifically, if you have ovaries that are cyclical, like there is and what I mean by that is they're producing hormones cyclically, right? This is not menopause. We need research there, although I think that one's a little bit easier because of where the hormones are in terms of being more matched to a male counterpart. But the majority of a woman's experience is not understood when through the lens of autism and ADHD. And that is where knowing your own body, knowing your own data, and understanding that you never need a research study to validate what is true for you, whatever your truth is absolutely your truth.
Absolutely, first of all, and there are two main things to underline here that I would like to respond to. The first one is that hormones can make a massive difference. I've had a lot of people over the years making my content, transgender individuals, saying that when they started transitioning and they took hormones, the presentation of their symptoms of ADHD and autism did change.
Yeah.
They felt that their brain felt different, that their symptoms felt different. And there is an interaction with hormones. There absolutely is. And this is something that needs to be addressed, that needs to be understood, so that people who are born with a uterus or without it, who are cis or who are trans or whatever, can better understand their own experience. Transitioning, for example, is just a hard enough thing. If on top of that you have to adjust how your ADHD reacts, it becomes nightmarish.
Yeah.
Just having a doctor that maybe can tell you, look, you're going to take testosterone or estrogen, this, and this is what you might expect from your ADHD symptoms. Cool. Thank you, doctor. I will make adjustment before this happens.
Yeah.
Excellent, right? Just this. The second thing is also that studies, research, medicine, all of that works statistically, which means that you take 100 people, 60 of them will show these traits. That also means that 40 of them won't. And this is one question that I get again and again about medication, about people saying, but medication, right, methylphenidate didn't work for me. Does that mean that I don't have ADHD? No. Studies show that 70% of people respond well to medication. That means that you're going to have 3 people for each 10 that take it that are simply either not going to respond at all or are going to have massive side effects. That doesn't mean that it doesn't work for everybody else. And that doesn't mean that it works for 100% of people, right? The lived experiences is so valuable because it's not a statistic. When I do my content, I try to base myself a lot on studies, because at the end of the day, what is observable again and again and again probably is true. But it's also true that, again, it's statistical. So if you don't feel represented by a statistic, remember that this is a number. And that you're actually represented by that number because you fall within the percentage of people who don't have that. And that's okay. It doesn't make your experience any less valid.
Have you ever seen a study on trans individuals and ADHD or autism?
I haven't seen a study about that yet, no.
I've never seen a study. That's why I was curious. And that's why, so I focus in women's health. I used to work in transgender care, but I just wasn't seeing enough patients that I felt like there were better people I could refer them to, that's all they were doing. And, working in women's health, I'm so careful now when I speak about things, because I will have trans individuals say, like, well, why aren't you using more inclusive language? So, for example, and I might be talking about an herb vitex. I'm like, I can't. Because the study is on women who, they were assigned female at birth, okay? For all intents and purposes, that's the definition here. And with that, I cannot just say people with, ovaries or menstruators or things like that, because if you're on certain medications for that transition, that may interfere. And I am so careful. And so sometimes people are like, you're not being inclusive enough. And I'm like, I am purposefully not including people because the research, we don't have that research. And to do that and to speak in such a way, that would be irresponsible. And so I want anybody listening to this to understand that, like, as we use these terms and as we talk about these things, it's not to exclude people purposely. It's that research has excluded people. Yep. And this is where, again, listening to your own body, being hyper aware of how your symptoms, and I mean that, being hyper aware, like paying way more attention that, like, because even, if you are neurodivergent, giving someone, we might say, okay, well, this is the typical dose of estrogen that we would give. That may impact you differently. Giving someone testosterone, there's a correlation. Those with polycystic ovarian syndrome have a higher incidence of being diagnosed with ADHD. That's a hyperandrogen state. There's also insulin dysregulation. There's inflammation components. So it's a lot more than just testosterone and other androgens being elevated, but it tells us that testosterone can play a significant role. Yep. And so I just bring this all up because I don't want people to feel excluded. And at the same time, I want them to understand that, like, research is so lacking in the funding that they haven't been included there. And we can't just speak broadly about these things without risking doing harm in some instances. And so that's why I would always refer people back. Meet with your practitioner, have a one-on-one conversation, and they are very unlikely to have expertise in any neurodivergent condition, given what they're managing. So it is about advocating that you get the referral to the person who does. And there is a very, the number of people who are truly, like, autistic and ADHD friendly providers and very knowledgeable about it. There's a lot of people out there marketing it. And then I have conversations with them and they're like, we can cure autism. And I'm like, I am walking out of this conversation because no. But to find them, I feel like it's a little bit, of a challenge sometimes, but then to find those who have that skill plus they understand the hormonal component is like finding a unicorn. So with that, if you are one of those practitioners, could you comment and let us know how people can contact you below this? So wherever you are in the world, because we have an international audience. Is there anything you want to add to that? I just kind of had a little rant there.
No, I mean, I think you said everything that it's also, on my mind and in my heart, that research is exclusive. It does exclude certain populations because it's not trendy, because it's not nice. And I mean, we probably will get there eventually. It's just that it's also that research is painfully slow. It's painfully slow. It takes 20, 30 years to get something really confirmed. And so this is also what is really hard about this. Yeah. And this is also why I mentioned the thing about, people transitioning who felt that their ADHD or autism was different, because if there is anyone here listening to this that is also transitioning and is thinking to themselves, what the hell is happening to me? Maybe you'll have an answer. Yeah. And, and if that helps even just one person, I'm happy about that. On the how to contact
Thank you.
On the how to contact me and on the practice. So I've recently started ADHD coaching because, as you said, I found it very difficult to find ADHD-informed practitioners. And I've been spending the last 2.5 years doing content on ADHD from the lived experience, but also a massive amount of research papers. And I've just thought I would love to help people. So I've gotten out and I got a coaching certification. But I also have, a day job. So I kind of just don't have a lot of time for that. It's just, if possible, I like to help people. People can contact me on my Instagram, on my TikTok, on my email. My accounts are brain.curiosities, and from there's like my website and all of my links. So just feel free to go check them out.
We'll be linking everything in the show notes so that people know. All of that will be there and very easy to find. Before I let you go, though, I got a couple more questions for you. So I do want to go.
Everything you want.
You talked about burnout. You brought out burnout multiple times. What is burnout? Why do people experience it? How can they avoid it?
So burnout is a state of prolonged stress after which your body at some point just has enough and crashes. Your stress response, your immediate stress response driven by adrenaline, by cortisol, and by all of that funny stuff is something that is supposed to get you out of dangerous situations. You know, you're out in the wild, you meet a tiger, you run. Stress response. The stress response is supposed to go down afterwards, which makes you feel tired and exhausted. But if you have that sometimes, then that's fine. If you have the stress response all the time, your body and brain will think that they are constantly in danger, which will increase how you respond to stress. You will be increasingly sensitive to stress. And so everything going wrong, everything happening will make you completely lose your marbles. Right, this is a very scientific explanation.
Well, I think people much prefer understanding what we're talking about than the full scientific. So I think you're in good company.
And burnout is usually described in 5 big stages. There were originally 12, but then like now that it's a bit more popular, it got reduced to 5, which is the first one is the honeymoon phase. You get excited, you take on a lot of stuff. Then you have the onset of the stress phase. You start feeling stress, chronic stress. You start having physical symptoms like back pain. You can't manage to sleep. You have digestive issues as well. You bring the stress home. You kind of snap at everybody. Then you have the burnout phase, which is characterized by apathy. It's just basically your body crashing and telling you, now we don't care anymore. We get eaten by the tiger. Cool. We drown in the river. Cool. I don't care. And then you have the chronic burnout. You just stop caring because it's too much for the body to handle. And then you have the chronic and habitual burnout, which is basically you cycling between stress, resentment, and anger, and the apathy. So one day you're going to be super angry, and the other day you'll be like, yeah. And this is burnout. And people with ADHD are a lot more sensitive to burnout for multiple reasons, right? The first one is emotional dysregulation. You're more sensitive to stress, so you're more likely to go into those stress phases. But also, we are more impulsive and we like new shiny things. So we're also a lot more likely to get into the honeymoon phase and take on a lot of stuff that becomes too much 2 days later. And understanding how burnout works, understanding how ADHD works will help people maybe manage this better because they will know when they have a new exciting and shiny thing, maybe not to say yes right away because that can lead to burnout. Again, awareness there is key because when you know how you function, when you know what to look out for, then things become a lot clearer.
Yeah. How can people know that they're on the edge of burnout, like they're on that road on the way there? How can they cultivate that self-awareness?
I mean, a lot of it comes from doing these kind of body scans that we talked about before and understanding if you're feeling stressed, tired, exhausted, apathetic, angry, or excited in your day-to-day life. Most people with ADHD that I've met and that I've known honestly are already into some sort of burnout and they're cycling through these 5 stages very fast. There's been some preliminary evidence that people with ADHD cycle faster through burnout. So they get into burnout faster and then they resume the cycle again and again and again, which makes things more difficult. But I would say, developing that awareness of yourself, of your internal states, of your emotional states, and also of your physiological states, because sometimes you feel exhausted because you haven't slept in 3 nights, or because you haven't eaten, or because you didn't drink any water today. So kind of just understanding where that tiredness comes from can be very helpful. And also having the awareness of, getting into the honeymoon phase, because this is something that amazingly has stayed in the research during all of these years on burnout. And it always starts with a honeymoon phase, with a phase of overexcitement and with a phase of, I'm going to get everything done. There is a problem, no issue, I'm going to get everything done. And whenever you get into that kind of excitement phase, maybe put in place tools to limit how much you do to not get into burnout. That can be very helpful.
I love that. Yesterday, I identified that I was getting into that honeymoon phase and I was talking to my assistant and I was like, and I got this done and I'm doing this and I'm going to take on this and da-da-da-da-da. And I caught myself and I was like, you know what? I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to listen. I have this like affirmations app where I listen to affirmations, and some of them are about like feeling your body and how's your body feeling. And I went for a walk, and then I came back and I asked my assistant, like, how much do you think is reasonable? And she's like, how about we just focus on one thing? And I'm like, thank you. I have to have that person there to check me, but it was something that I definitely saw coming. And I was like, and I feel like part of it is like I've done that enough times that I'm like, oh, I know you. I know where we're going. And that can be challenging to have that awareness. I definitely think when you're younger too, because you have more energy, you have more capacity. For me, having 2 children, running a company, doing all of this stuff, I'm like, I have to be stingy with my energy sometimes. Yep. And when I get really excited and I want to do all the things, I have to just really have that external check sometimes where I go outside, I do that work, and I talk to my assistant. I talk to somebody about like, can you be a mirror? Can you be a mirror for me and just like let me see what I'm doing right now, so that because it can be such a challenge. People who are in burnout right now, who are like, I'm already there. I do not care. Any predator, come, take me away. What can they do to start to come out of that?
So the first step, which seems very obvious again, is to recognize that you're in burnout. You're like, okay, I'm in a burnout. So yeah. Now what? The general advice is to, whenever you have a stressor, to get away from the stressor. If you can take holidays, take holidays. If you can get a medical leave, get a medical leave. Honestly, I know that in the US, it's extremely hard to do this because the system is messed up. But in Europe, there are a lot of countries where there is free healthcare and you can actually take medical leaves while continuing to be paid. So if you're in one of those countries, just do that. Honestly, just do that. Take a medical leave and take care of your health. Figure out what got you into burnout in the first place, and make sure that you change enough things in your life so that you don't get back into burnout. And one thing that you've mentioned and that I would like to bounce off on is focus on one thing, especially with ADHD, especially when we're trying to heal, especially when we're trying to get better. We want to do everything, and we want to do everything perfectly. And we're like, tomorrow I'm going to wake up at 6 and go to the gym and eat healthy and get a new job and start a new project, and you get overwhelmed and it doesn't happen, right? Because it's too much. Focus just on one thing. And I'm saying like the smallest possible thing. When I started working on routines, when I got diagnosed, when a partner started working on routines 3.5 years ago with a psychiatrist, the routine was taking a shower every day. That was it, right? That is the minimal step that you can take, the smallest thing that you can do today and feel confident about being able to maintain for 6 months, no matter how many things come your way. This is your starting point. And then you go to the next step, and then you go to the next step, but focus on one thing. If you try to change your nutrition, change your habits, change your gym routine, change everything, it's going to be too much too fast. So just one thing, that's it. And honestly, it feels long, and it is, but it's also solid, because once you start implementing these changes little by little, it becomes part of your life. It becomes part of who you are. It becomes even part of your small evening or morning rituals. And then they're solid. And then even when you're in a burnout, even when things go bad at work, even during a breakup, you're going to keep doing these things because they are solidified. And this is what we want to get to. We want to have a new minimum. We want to make sure that your bad days in 3 years are not as bad as your bad days today. That's it.
I love that. And I think that's actually perfect advice for anyone, especially, in the new year, everybody's like, oh, I want to hit, I'm going to change everything about my life. And something I have said to my patients time and time again, and if you're listening, you're probably like, we've heard this, is that I have almost never seen somebody change everything and take on everything in a treatment plan and actually be successful. They usually make it a week or two, and then they give up everything. And what I find is so much more effective is, even if you just work on 3 days You could be 3, I don't know why. Odd works better. 3, 5, 7. That seems to work really well for people of like, you know what, just today, as you were saying, taking a shower or going for a walk, or maybe I'm going to add an extra serving of vegetable. Even when I tell people to, we need to get up to like 5 to 7 servings of fruits and vegetables a day, that sounds overwhelming. And I'm like, and we're going to start with 1 serving every day. If you're eating 0, 1 serving every day. If you're eating 1, then it's 2 every day. And you do that for a week. And then the next week you add an additional 1. And it seems so little, but I think so often about the analogy of like how pyramids are built. They are built by a solid foundation, and you set the solid foundation and you can reach great heights, but only if the foundation is solid.
And in a lot of these things, it's often better to do it badly than not at all.
I love that. Yes, give permission. Like done is better than perfect.
Do it badly. If your struggle is eating every day, eat a snack. It's better than not eating, right? And there are so many messages about this food is good, this food is bad, this habit is good, this habit is bad. Get that out of your mind. Doing it badly is better than not at all. The bare minimum will already be better than nothing. So just, give yourself permission to exist as a human being, because, come on. It's unrealistic. No one gets 7 servings of vegetables per day. I think in the United States, maybe only 15% of the population does that or something along those lines. It's crazy to think that we have to do everything perfectly. No one does.
Mm-hmm. And it's something that you're not going to do it right every single day either. And that is where, I say, like on your good days, if you have gotten good sleep, if you have fed yourself well, then on the not so good days, you can be gentle with yourself because you know that you already put into the pot, so to speak, and you can draw from some of that. So I think the notion of you don't have to be perfect and giving yourself permission to do things in the best way that you can is a perfect place to wrap this. So I want to say thank you so much for your time. I know that we are like opposite sides of the world right now, and you made time to come on and to share all of this valuable information with everybody, all of my listeners. And so I'm just super, super grateful. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me. This has been absolutely fantastic. I've loved the conversation, and I loved where we finished it because, it's important to just remind people that being kind to yourself is just really, really important, especially when struggling with mental health. We do what we can.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again. And everybody listening, we will put all the links in the show notes. So if you would love to follow Ludovico and consume his content in the same way I have, then I will have that accessible for you. So thank you again.
Thank you very, very much.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. If this is the kind of content you're into, then I highly recommend checking out this.